Okay, we've already talked about how Huck Finn was controversial from the start, and you've already seen examples of how Twain was known for his sharp and biting wit. To kick us off today, I want to share one more quick story that shows us just how sharp that wit could be. In 1905, so 21 years after Huck Finn had first been published, Twain received a letter from a Brooklyn-based librarian detailing his distress that there were plans to move Twain's books from the children's section into the adults only because of how vulgar they were. The man with some level of self-importance had positioned himself as the champion defending the merit of those stories for all ages, and asked if Twain wouldn't mind writing a few lines in defense of Huck's character for this librarian to use in his case. And Twain wrote him back, but not in the way you would expect. Instead of defending his own creation, he responded with one of the most ingeniously sarcastic notes I've ever read. And here it is. Dear Sir, I am greatly troubled by what you say. I wrote Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn for adults exclusively, and it always distresses me when I find that boys and girls have been allowed access to them. The mind that becomes soiled in youth can never again be washed clean. I know this by my own experience, and to this day, I cherish an unappeasable bitterness against the unfaithful guardians of my young life, who not only permitted, but compelled me to read an uncensored Bible through before I was 15. None can do that and ever draw a clean, sweet breath again this side of the grave. Ask that young lady, she will tell you so. Most honestly do I wish I could say a softening word or two in defense of Huck's character since you desire it, but really, in my opinion, it is no better than those of Solomon, David, Satan, and the rest of the sacred brotherhood. If there is an uncensored Bible in the children's department, won't you please help that young woman remove Huck and Tom from that questionable companionship? Sincerely yours, signed S.L. Clemens. I shall not show your letter to anyone. It is safe with me. So, here he is again, always quick to point out hypocrisy, especially when religion was involved. But the fact that he decided it was more fun to take shots at the hypocrisy of these libraries without ever trying to defend his own book shows that Samuel Clemens really was a force to be reckoned with. And with that, let's dive back in, shall we? Just a quick recap, after their raft was plowed over by a steamship, Huck found himself a welcome addition to the Grangerfords, a family who was in a feud with the Shepherdsons. And after a Romeo and Juliet-style elopement between members of those families, a bloodbath let out, which resulted in Huck running back to Jim, who was waiting in the swamp with the raft, where they put all that ugliness behind them and set out on the river once more. 3 days had gone by since leaving the bloodbath at the Grangerfords. Huck was less talkative than usual as he remembered witnessing the death of his friend Buck. Jim didn't talk much either, but he was relieved to be out of the swamp finally. They fell back into their routine of floating by night and hiding on the riverbanks by day. Huck describes those lazy nights on the river, saying that sometimes we'd have the whole river all to ourselves for the longest time. Yonder was the banks and the islands, across the water, and maybe a spark, which was a candle in a cabin window. And sometimes on the water you could see a spark or two, a light coming from a raft or a scow, and maybe you could hear a fiddle or a song coming over from one of them crafts. It's lovely to live on a raft. We had the sky up there, all speckled with stars, and we used to lay on our backs and look up at them and discuss about whether they was made or only just happened. But everything changed unexpectedly one day as they were on the riverbank fishing for their next meal. Huck was just up an inlet from the raft in his canoe looking for some berries when 2 men came running right at him. Huck thought he was gone for sure, but when they reached Huck, instead of violence, they begged him to spare their lives. They both said they were being chased despite not having done anything wrong. Men and dogs were coming. But before he let them in his canoe, Huck was smart enough to tell them to walk through the creek a ways first so that their scents would be gone, throwing off any dogs. Once the men had done this, they climbed in, and Huck began paddling the canoe back towards the river, where Jim was waiting on the banks with the raft. As they got closer to the river, he began to hear men yelling and dogs barking, so they weren't completely lying at any rate, but they had put just enough distance behind them that the immediate threat was calmed, and they rejoined Jim for some breakfast, while Huck took in his canoe mates in detail. Quote, one of these fellows was about 70 or upwards, and he had a bald head and very gray whiskers. He had an old battered-up slouch hat on and a greasy blue woolen shirt, and ragged old blue jean breeches stuffed into his boot tops. The other fellow was about 30 and dressed about as ornery. After breakfast, we all laid off and talked, and the first thing that come out was that these chaps didn't even know each other. "What got you into trouble?" the older man asked the other. The younger man said he had been selling a teeth-whitening product that worked just fine at taking tartar off. The only problem was it kind of took the enamel off as well. He stayed in town just one night too long, and the people figured it out before he had dipped. "What about you?" the younger man asked. The older man says he had been running a tent revival for about a week. It was going great, making $5 or $6 a night, until a slave saw him drinking from a jug and ratted him out to the townsfolk. Said that as he ran off, he heard threats of tarring and feathering being flung at him. The younger man laughed. "Old-timer," he said, "I reckon we might double-team it together. What do you think?" "I might be agreeable," the other said. Huck was watching this exchange in silent fascination. "What's your usual racket?" the old one asked. "I used to be a printer by trade. I dabble in patent medicines, theater actor. I've messed around with mesmerism and phrenology before, loads of other stuff. You?" "I done a lot of doctoring in my years, laying on of hands. I tell fortunes, preaching, as I mentioned already, missionarying around." Everyone sat in silence for a brief time before the young man sighed heavily and said, "Alas, to think I should have lived to lead such a life, to be degraded down into such company." "What do you mean?" the bald man asked. "Oh, I don't mean to say you are all not worthy of me. I did this to myself. I may still die of a broken heart for what I have lost." "Say what you mean," the old man said. "What's this about a broken heart?" "You won't believe me when I tell you, gentlemen, the secret of my birth." "Secret of your what?" "Gentlemen," the younger companion said as he straightened his shoulders and tilted his head back, "my great-grandfather, eldest son of the Duke of Bridgewater, fled to this country at the end of the last century so he could breathe the air of freedom. My father was the rightful heir, but his younger brother seized the titles and estates. The rightful heir, me, was ignored. I am the rightful Duke of Bridgewater, and yet here I am, hunted by men and despised by this cold, cruel world." Jim's jaw hung open in awe. Huck felt bad for the man. He said as much, too, and the younger man said that if they wanted to be helpful, they could refer to him by the proper terms of "Your Grace" or "My Lord," and if they wanted to wait on him at mealtimes, that would restore a bit of his dignity. The old man sat back this whole time with a squinting smile and a mischievous gleam in his eye. "Now looky here, Bilgewater," he said. "I'm a heap sorry for you, but you ain't the only person that had troubles like that." "No?" the man who would be called Duke asked. "No, you ain't. You ain't the only person been snaked down wrongfully out some high place." "What do you mean?" Duke said. "Bilgewater, can I trust you?" "To the bitter death," the Duke said with an air. The old man looked as if he was wrestling with the choice to give up his secret before saying, "Bilgewater, I am the late Dauphin." "The what?" the younger man said. "Yes, my friend, it's true. Your eyes are at this very moment looking at the poor disappeared Dauphin, Louis XVII, son of Louis and Marie Antoinette." "No," the other man scoffed. "You're more like the late Charlemagne at your age, my friend, by the age of you." "It is trouble that has done it, Bilgewater. I am gray and bald beyond my years. A king wandering in exile wearing blue jeans instead of wearing the crown of France." The king began to shed tears, and now Huck and Jim didn't know how to express enough sympathy for this man either, and how lucky they were to be in the presence of not one, but two members of noble birth. The Duke seemed to catch what was going on, and also consoled the king for his loss as Jim and Huck agreed to call him Your Majesty, and also wait on him at mealtimes. The four travelers shoved off onto the river, Huck and Jim now basically servants to these two royals. Huck made sure to note that it didn't take long for him to piece together that these two were actually just liars, nothing but low-down frauds, but he didn't say anything because at least there'd be no quarrels if he called them the Duke and the King and gave them their food first. "If I never learned nothing else out of Pap," he writes, "I learned that the best way to get along with his kind of people is to let them have their own way." It didn't take too long before the two newcomers asked about Jim. Was he a runaway? "Do you think a runaway slave would head south?" Huck asked, receiving head shakes in return. He then spit a fresh yarn about how his pa was sending the two of them to live with Huck's uncle in Orleans, but that they typically only float at night to avoid just such accusations of a runaway slave. The Duke scratched his chin and said he would come up with a way to get around that constraint. Just give him some time. But the next day, King and Duke decided it was time to plan their next campaign, as they called it. Duke pulled out a pile of handbills from his carpetbag. Would he be the celebrated Dr. Armand de Montauban of Paris, lecturing on phrenology, or maybe it was time to pull out the world-renowned Shakespearean actor Garrick the Younger. King sounded intrigued by Garrick, so Duke ran with it. King said he didn't have any acting experience, but Duke said that didn't matter. In 3 days' time, he would have his partner in crime ready to recreate the sword fight from Richard III, to perform the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet, and maybe they'd top off the show with Hamlet's soliloquy. "You want me to play a woman?" the king asked, confused. "With my shiny head?" "Oh, you'll be in costume, good fellow," the Duke said with a hearty laugh. He began pulling some costume pieces from his bag and immediately began to rehearse lines with the king. As they approached a small town on the left bank, Duke said he wanted to stop off and see if they had a printer because he'd thought of a way to get around the whole Jim being seen on the river in the daytime issue. So they pulled over, Duke went off to find a printer, Huck and King wandered around while Jim stayed hidden down by the riverbank. King and Huck walked around until they found a revivalist preacher with a tent full of sinners who were sweating it out on that hot day. They sang hymns with a lot of gusto, and some began to shout in nonsense languages that Huck didn't understand. The preacher was one of those real dramatic types that probably would have been good as an actor. "Oh, come to the mourner's bench," he cried. The crowd replied with a hearty, "Amen! Come, black, those black with sin. Amen! Come, lame and halt and blind. Amen! Come with a broken spirit and let the waters of heaven cleanse you. Enter and be at rest. Glory, hallelujah," the crowd cheered. Huck looked up at King and was almost scared at how excited the old man looked. He was almost bouncing up and down with excitement. It seemed that he had hatched an idea for a little side scheme of his own. And it didn't take much longer before King was wailing and hollering louder than the rest of them, working his way up to the front until he caught the preacher's attention. The preacher asked him to speak to the people, tell his story of salvation. This was exactly what the king was hoping for. He told them how he was a pirate. He'd been a pirate for 30 years out in the Indian Ocean, and his crew was thinned out considerably last spring in a fight. And he was home now to take out some fresh men, and thanked to goodness he'd been robbed last night and put ashore off of a steamboat without a cent. And he was glad of it. It was the blessedest thing that ever happened to him, because he was a changed man now, and happy for the first time in his life. And, poor as he was going to start right off and work his way back to the Indian Ocean, and put in the rest of his life trying to turn the pirates into the true path. For he could do it better than anyone else, being acquainted with all the pirate crews in that ocean. And though it would take him a long time to get there without money, he would get there anyway. And every time he convinced a pirate, he would say to him, "Don't you thank me, don't you give me no credit. It all belongs to them dear people in Polkville camp meeting. Natural brothers and benefactors of the race. And that dear preacher there, the truest friend a pirate ever had." And just like that, a collection hat was being passed around. Women and girls came up and kissed him on the cheek and blessed him for his determination. They invited him to stay at their houses, but he said he needed to get back to the Indian Ocean as soon as possible. The two of them got back to the raft with almost $88. The king was chuckling, saying this was the single biggest haul he'd ever made in one day. By the time the Duke returned, he had also run his own little gambit, because the only print shop in town had actually been abandoned. Duke found his way inside and started running the job he'd set out for, but when people stopped by, he pretended he was the new owner. And in only a few hours, in the abandoned shop, he had sold jobs for handbills, newspaper ads, subscriptions, and more to the locals who thought they finally had a printer back in town. He'd made about $10 of his own, but the real prize of the excursion was this. He held out a wanted ad with what looked like Jim's face on it. "Runaway slave," it said, $200 reward. The description on the handbill said that he was from a plantation down south, and the Duke proceeded to explain his plan. This way, they could just tie Jim up if anyone approached the raft in the daytime. They'd show the bill and claim they'd caught him and were returning him to his owner down south for the reward. The king was very pleased at the cleverness of his friend, but, as you can imagine, Jim wasn't too keen on the idea. But what could he do? Tell a white man no? That night, after the two royals were asleep, Jim quietly asked Huck if he thought they would run into any more kings on this trip. "No, I reckon not," Huck said. "That's all right with me then," he said. "2 kings is more than enough." So you may have picked up on this theme already. This book is almost like a series of sketch interactions, like episodes in a TV show. Jim and Huck are the recurring characters, but every few chapters, they're in a completely different environment. And as you may guess, since I'm bothering to bring this up, this isn't a coincidence. This is a genre of novel that is known as picaresque, from the Spanish pícaro, meaning rogue. The picaresque is a traditionally Spanish novel structure where the hero is a low-born trickster going through episodic encounters on the road, surviving by his wits through loosely connected adventures. I know, that is a wildly specific type of book genre, isn't it? But the beauty of the picaresque is that it allows the character to engage with people from all walks of life and all sorts of economic situations in the course of one novel, which gives the author the ability to acknowledge or critique even society at all levels through them. Lazarillo de Tormes and even Don Quixote to an extent are examples of the genre. But one key to a true picaresque that semi-disqualifies Huck Finn is that the picaro, or the main character, can't grow or learn anything over the course of the novel. They're basically like a Seinfeld character. And Huck has already shown some inclinations to change, and we'll see if he's got more of that in the tank. So the true characterization of this novel might be saying that it's a hybrid between a picaresque and the Bildungsroman, which is the genre coined by German literature for a coming-of-age story where the young main character learns valuable life lessons. I think we talked about this all the way back when we did Little Women. So there's your little lit history lesson for this episode, and another proof that Twain was a very innovative and well-versed author. In the next chapter, we open to the Duke rehearsing his Hamlet's soliloquy. I'm going to read it quickly and then dissect it to show how much fun Twain had with this low-life criminal trying to recite some of the finest prose the English language has given us. To be or not to be, that is the bare bodkin that makes calamity of so long life. For who would fardos bear till Burnham Wood do come to Dunsinane, but that the fear of something after death murders the innocent sleep, great nature's second course, and makes us rather sling the arrows of outrageous fortune than fly to others that we know not of. There's the respect must give us pause. Wake, Duncan, with thy knocking. I would thou couldst, for who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the law's delay, and the quietus which his pangs might take in the dead waste, and middle of the night when churchyards yawn and actually, I've said enough of it for you to get the points that I want to make. I forgot how long this section is. All I have to say is he ends it with the line about get thee to a nunnery, which is from a different speech entirely. But if you're a big Shakespeare head, you already saw some of the discrepancies, but actually, if your only exposure to Shakespeare is what I have covered on the show, that's actually all that you need to understand this, because first off, he does open with the right first line, to be or not to be. Boom, nailed it. He also does quote quite a few lines, almost word for word, but there are two big blunders, which are one, he mixes and matches lines from all over the soliloquy. To be or not to be is followed by that is the bare bodkin, which in the actual one doesn't come until 20 plus lines down. But the even more humorous thing that Twain included, Dunsinane, Duncan, Burnham Wood, any of those sound familiar? Because they're not Hamlet, those are all things from Macbeth. I knew as soon as I saw he was having the character quote the soliloquy that Twain wouldn't pass up on the opportunity to fill it with irony, and I was not disappointed. We then spend a whole chapter's worth of pages on a story that once again has so little to do with our characters that I again assumed this was based on something real from Twain's life, or at least his awareness, and once again, I was right. The story is that the rafters pulled over into one town to print handbills for their big Shakespearean show. But the town they stop in has an incident while they're there. A notorious drunk stomps into town threatening a man named Sherburne. The drunk threatens Sherburne, who promptly told the man to leave, saying he is insulting to deal with, and that if he comes back, he would defend himself. Well, the drunk went off and came right back, and Sherburne proceeds to shoot him dead in the street, even though the drunk, who was named Boggs, didn't have a weapon on him. The second half of the story involves a mob following Sherburne to his house, saying they're going to deal with him as they see fit. They make it as far as to destroy half of his fence, when Sherburne comes back outside through a window on the roof of his porch, holding a double-barrel shotgun. He was emotionless, but stood there stoic and threatening. The crowd hushed in awe of his confidence. Eventually, the whole crowd wilted under the gaze of Sherburne and looked at the ground or took a step back in response to his sheer presence. And then check out this line. Quote, then pretty soon Sherburne sort of laughed. Not the pleasant kind, but the kind that makes you feel like when you're eating bread that's got sand in it. But then Sherburne addresses the crowd, saying, the idea of you lynching anybody, it's amusing. You miserable cowards think you're brave enough to lynch a man just because you will tar and feather poor, defenseless, cast-out women that come along here? Why, a man is safe in the presence of 10,000 like you, as long as it's daylight and you're not behind him. I know your type. I was raised in the South but lived in the North, and I've seen what the average man is like. The average man is a coward. In the North, he lets anybody walk all over him. But here in the South, your newspapers call you brave so much that you've come to believe you're braver than anyone else. But in reality, you're just as brave as the average man, which is to say, you ain't brave at all. Oh, you'll kill a man, but you'll do it like cowards, 100 versus 1, in the dark, while wearing masks. That's the Southern way of being brave. There was silence in the crowd as they didn't know how to respond. Now get out of my yard, he said, raising his gun up to his shoulder and aiming at nobody in particular. With that, everybody turned and ran. There's a bit more to the story, but that's the bulk of it. And although I don't know how much of the mob and the rooftop monologue were tied to truth, the story of the man killing a drunk without much cause was real. It happened in Twain's childhood town of Hannibal, and the story goes that he either witnessed this encounter or more probably he just witnessed the aftermath in the town and it stuck with him. But that monologue was just another chance for him to poke at the hypocrisy he saw in the romanticized version of Southern culture by pointing out how he felt that lynch mobs wearing masks wasn't a particularly honorable way of killing anybody. We just talked about the idea of the picaresque, which means a story like this isn't out of bounds, but what makes it stand out a bit is we only hear it because Huck is literally observing it happen, and then when it's over, he moves on. He's not actually involved in any way, but maybe Twain just needed to write it down to find catharsis for the real murder in his own hometown. The next day, they set up all the handbills for their show. They had rented out the courthouse and opened to a grand total of about 12 people. And even those just laughed at all the wrong parts. The Duke was furious. And after it was over, he said they were retooling for the next night to something known to make more money. The next day, he made new posters. For 3 nights only, at the courthouse. 3 nights only. World-renowned tragedians David Gorick the Younger and Edmund Kean the Elder from the London Continental Theatres. The King's Camel Leopard, or the Royal Nonsuch. 50 cents admission. Ladies and children not admitted. There, the Duke said with a gleam in his eye. If that doesn't make 'em line up at the door, I don't know Arkansas. And it turns out he did know Arkansas, because that night the entire courthouse was jam-packed with men. When it was time for the show, Duke gave a riveting speech about how this was the most thrillingest tragedy ever written, and that these men would likely be changed forever after this story. And just when the crowd was baited on his every word, the curtain went up and out came King on all fours, naked. And painted with so many colors and stripes, he was like a rainbow zebra, or, as the title, a camel leopard. He pranced around the stage and everyone lost it. The room filled with roars of laughter. King went off stage, and just when the laughter began to die, he ran back out and did it again, and the roars came back once more. After the curtain was lowered, Duke thanked everyone for coming and said the great tragedy would only be performed 2 more nights. What? Roared the crowd. That's all? Yes, it's over, Duke said with a nervous smile. Swindlers, people yelled, and some began to move up to the stage. But just then, a large and prominent-looking man hushed the crowd before it got too crazy. Now, I know you feel tricked right about now, but we wouldn't want this to get out that we were fooled into wasting our money like this. We'd get a reputation for being the only men in town to get duped, wouldn't we? We'd never hear the end of it. So here's what we're gonna do. He then laid out a plan that everyone here was to go out and talk the show up, say that it was the funniest thing they'd ever witnessed, and get everyone to spend their money on it too. That way, no one would get the better of them. It turned out this man was the town judge, so the other men respected his opinion. The next day, the whole town was buzzing with the masterful performance of the camel leopard. And on the second night, the house was packed, and they hauled in even more money. And by the third night, the courthouse didn't have a single space of standing room left in it. But instead of being newcomers, it was all the men from the first 2 nights. come to exact their revenge on these swindling performers. Huck was standing next to Duke at the front as men filed in, pockets full of something. Huck assumed it was rotten fruit. And when the place was packed, Duke paid a man to watch the door for a minute and then walked, telling Huck to follow him. "You walk fast now till you get away from the houses, and then we run for the raft like the devil himself was after you." Huck ran from the town, wondering how long it would take for the mob inside to realize they had actually been duped one more time. King was already waiting for them on the raft with Jim, and they shoved off into the night, not daring to light a lamp until they were 10 miles downstream. The two con men couldn't stop laughing. "Greenhorns," Duke yelled. "I knew the first night's crowd would keep mum and let the rest of them get roped in on the second night, and I knew they'd come for us on the third." They had made almost $500 between the 3 nights. It was more money than Huck had ever seen, except for the treasure that he and Tom Sawyer had found at least. When the two cons were asleep in their tent, Jim and Huck had a conversation for the first time in days. Jim was feeling awfully low. He misses his family. Huck just stood there silently, wondering what it would be like to have a family worth missing. A day or two downriver from their last adventure, they parked the raft, leaving Jim tied up in case anyone found him so they could stick to their story of having captured the runaway from Orleans, and Duke, King, and Huck went into town. King and Duke got some nicer-looking clothes with all their money, and they went in to get some decent food, but a man stopped them on the street. He approached King and said, "Mr. Wilkes, I saw you and knew at once it must be you." "I'm sorry," King said, "but you are mistaken. I am Blodgett, Alexander Blodgett, Reverend Alexander Blodgett." "Oh," the young man said, "well, I had hoped it was Mr. Wilkes so I could know he had made it back in time for the funeral, but, well, I guess he'll still get his property all the same." Duke and King's heads snapped to attention. "Property, you say? Who is this Mr. Wilkes you speak of?" The local man, who was heading to Orleans himself, went on to say that in the town he comes from, one of the great families was the Wilkes family. There was George and Peter, William and Harvey. Peter had died some years back and left his 3 daughters to be raised by his oldest brother, George. William and Harvey had gone off to England years ago. Well, apparently George had been growing ill and was close to death, so word had been sent to his brothers in England, and the whole town was hoping they would arrive before George passed, but unfortunately, George had just passed the previous night. King and Duke gasped in feigned agony. "Those poor girls," Duke said. "Yes," the young traveler lamented. "Until their uncles arrive from England, they are being supported by neighbors, but no one has seen Harvey or William in decades, and with no photographs recently, the only signifiers people know to look for are that Harvey is a minister, and William is deaf and dumb, is how the book puts it. He uses sign language to communicate. Oh, and William is considerably younger, only 30 or 35, while Harvey is older." Duke and King give each other side-eyed glances as they continue to feign their sympathy. They offered to buy this poor young man a drink and proceeded to grill him about every detail he knew about this family, starting with the 3 nieces. There was Mary Jane, the oldest, who was 19 and a redhead. Susan was 15 and Joanna was 14 and had a cleft palate. He told them about the neighbors, the preacher, the doctor, and all sorts of other details about the Wilkes family. Peter had been in the tanning business, George had been a carpenter, and King tried to act nonchalant as he asked, "Was Mr. Wilkes well off?" "Oh, sure," the young stupid man said, not realizing he was aiding and abetting a criminal. "He had houses and land, and some believe he got thousands of dollars saved up somewhere." "And when did you say he died?" Duke asked. "Just last night. Funeral will probably be tomorrow." King said. "This is just so terribly sad, but I guess we all have to go some time or another." They bought their new best friend another drink and parted ways. As soon as he was gone, however, the 2 cons huddled up close and discussed basic details. "Duke, how are you at being deaf and dumb?" He said he had acted the part of such a person before and was confident he could pull it off. And just like that, the 4 of them hired a boat to take them downstream a bit to what might be the biggest score of their lives. As the boat docked already, the whispers began to circulate. "Is it them? Could it be?" They arrived at the Wilkes estate and were met by 3 young girls. Mary Jane, which, quote, was redheaded, but that don't make no difference. She was most awful beautiful. Sorry to all the gingers out there catching strays from Mark Twain. Then there was Susan and Joanna. King makes a big display of taking the girls in and letting a warm smile crawl over his face, and then throwing his arms open for a big hug. The girls rushed to meet their uncle before turning to a coffin in the corner of the great room. King put his arm around Duke, who was in character as a deaf and mute man, and the two of them mournfully walked over and put their hands over their hearts at the sight of the dead stranger they were pretending to be blood relatives of. King had then turned to the crowd of townsfolk who had followed them to the house, and shucks if he wasn't a good actor. He had worked himself up to be in a fit of emotions, blubbering as he tried to speak, and he gave a speech about the sore trial to him and his brother to travel thousands of miles only to find their dear brother already gone. But then the real hustle began, because he won over the crowd, thanking them for all of the parts they've played in his family's life, naming the very people he'd interrogated the poor stupid traveler about the day before. Reverend Hobson, Deacon Hovey, Mr. Ben Rucker, Levi Bell, and more. He won over the whole group, talking about how much his brother had written about these noble and good souls. And after embracing his nieces again, Mary Jane ran and got the will, which had remained sealed in an envelope until the arrival of Harvey. King opened it up and read it aloud, pausing for dramatic effect. The girls were left the house and 3,000 gold. The tan yard, which was a thriving business, along with some other properties and land worth about 7,000, were left to Harvey and William, and there was a separate note that he had buried 6,000 additional gold in the cellar. King said they would go dig up the buried gold and bring it up here for all to see, so everything was above board. He hissed at Huck to follow them with a candle. Once in the basement, King and Duke whispered excitedly about the massive, life-changing size of this score. They followed the instructions and found the bag right where it had been described. Their greedy eyes reflected gold in the candlelight. They sat and counted everything to discover it was actually $415 short of being 6,000. They wondered why this count could be so off and began to worry that people upstairs would assume they were hiding something. But wait, they had almost $600 between them from their last few scams like the pirate convert and the camel leopard stint. So they chipped in their own money to make it a nice round 6,000 and were about to head upstairs when the Duke had one more idea. "Let's go upstairs and count this money and then give it to the girls." King flinched for a second in confusion, but slowly his face showed recognition of what Duke intended. "That is a brilliant idea," he said. "If we give the money to the girls publicly, won't nobody suspect us of bad intentions? Then we can stick around long enough to sell everything for more money and take the 6,000 on our way out the door." The two of them practically giggled with delight at the thought of how much money was in play. Huck scrunched up his face. He'd only met them, but the girls seemed really nice, and he didn't feel right about taking everything their uncle had left them. But he knew better than to contest the two royals to their faces, so for now, he just followed them upstairs. They made a big show of King counting the money and then acted like an idea had just struck him. He used nonsense hand gestures to talk to his deaf and dumb brother, and then Duke acted all excited and made his own fake sign language back to King before he turned to the crowd and said, "Oh wait, I'm just realizing I think this is the actual first line I'm doing of King in this character, which he's got his very southern accent, but he's also trying to do a British accent poorly." Okay, let's see what I got here. Okay. So King turned to the crowd and said, "I knew he'd feel the same as I did, and it delights me to say, girls, take the money. All of it is yours." There was a shocked gasp from the crowd. Mary Jane rushed King to give him a big hug and kiss him on the cheek. There were tears all around and statements about the quality of these two gentlemen. They had the funeral the next day and a more private family gathering planned for that night. But King looked at the whole crowd and said they wanted everyone over the following evening. "Our dear brother loved everyone here, so all of you should be part of celebrating his life." Applause broke out, and they spent the rest of that day shaking hands, recalling stories about the neighbors whose names they'd all memorized. Everyone welcomed them and complimented them on their gentlemanly ways looking after their poor nieces. Well, all but one welcomed them, Dr. Robinson. He'd been eyeing the two of them with disdain since they first showed up, but had stayed quiet until now. He said King's accent was the worst Englishman he'd ever heard, that the two of them were probably frauds. The girls were scandalized that a family friend like Dr. Robinson would be so rude to their benefactors. I was your father's friend and your uncle's, and now I am your friend, he told them. And I am warning you, as a friend, that these two are imposters. How they know so much about us, I don't know, but these are not your uncles. What more proof could you want, Doctor? Mary Jane asked. And when the doctor said he had none, but asked her to turn this rascal out looking at King, Mary Jane thought for a moment, then puffed out her chest and said that this was her answer. She then took the bag of 6,000 gold, handed it back to King, and asked him to invest it for her and her sisters whatever way he deemed best. King looked at her lovingly, took the bag, and then Mary Jane took him by the arm as the crowd clapped and cheered at the signal of family unity. All right, the doctor said, I wash my hands of this matter, but I warn you, a time is a-comin' when you're gonna feel sick whenever you think of this day. Since they were about the same age, Huck was often positioned by Joanna, the youngest sister, and unlike her older siblings, she didn't seem quite as willing to accept these men as her uncles, and also Huck as their valet, which is what King had introduced him as. So that evening, when there was a big dinner for all the adults, Huck and Joanna ate together in the kitchen, and she started giving Huck a proper grilling. You ever seen the king, meaning the actual king of England, not our con man? Yes, Huck said. He goes to our church quite regular, has a pew next to ours. But he lives in London, Joanna said. Well, of course. But you live in Sheffield. Huck gulped as he realized the trap he had walked into. Time to kick his creative storytelling skills into high gear. Well, I mean, he's a regular at our church when he's in Sheffield. He comes there in the summertime to take sea baths. But Sheffield ain't on the sea, Joanna said. Who said it was? Why, you did. No, I didn't. This continued for some time, Joanna peppering Huck and him kind of failing to dig himself out. He was eventually saved by the older sisters who came in and scolded Joanna for being so rude to their guest, saying if she was a guest in a strange country, how would she like to be treated this way? Joanna apologized, but her eyes still said she didn't believe Huck. He felt nervous around her. And what was worse, the more he saw how kind and attentive Mary Jane and Suzanne were, he felt worse and worse about the plan that Duke and King were attempting to carry out. I felt so ornery and low down and mean, he writes, that I says to myself, my mind's made up. I'll have that money for them or bust. So he sneaks into Duke's room, which is where he believed the money was hidden, but partway into his search, he heard heavy footsteps, so he hid inside the closet. Duke and King came in and began talking anxiously. Duke feels like their luck is about up and says they should split town that night. King says they're so close to more than tripling their haul, assuring his partner that their cover was solid. The sisters and all the neighbors loved them. Who cared what that one doctor thought? Duke grumbled something more about feeling like a bag of gold was enough. He didn't feel right about taking everything from these orphans. King laughed as he reassured his friend that the girls wouldn't receive the worst of this, because of course, once they split town, everyone who bought the assets and property would be out the money. No court would let orphans be stripped of their own inheritance by fraud. The sales will be invalid the moment we split, King said. Duke took some encouragement at this and then said he doesn't think the money is hidden well enough. He's worried a slave might find it. Huck peered out between coats from his hiding spot as he watched King grab the bag out from behind a curtain and tear a hole in the straw mattress tick under the feather bed, stuffing the bag in the hole. There, happy, he said. Duke said he did feel better about it, and the two of them left. But Huck waited just long enough for their steps to die off before snagging the bag of gold and slipping out of the room. He was halfway done with his good deed. It was late when Huck went downstairs with the gold during the night into the parlor. He was looking for a good hiding place that wouldn't be his room in case King and Duke searched it once they noticed the money was missing. He heard sounds and had to shove it in the first hiding spot he could reach for, the coffin. The lid sat open by a foot or two, just enough to show the dead man's peaceful face. Huck shoved the bag down by his arms under the lid and then hid himself behind the door and watched as Mary Jane came in, bent over the coffin, and cried. Her back was to Huck's hiding spot, so while she had a private session of mourning, Huck slipped up to his room, determined to figure out how to get the bag out later. Only problem was, when he woke up the next morning and went downstairs, the parlor was closed. They were preparing the casket for the funeral. It was only opened up once guests started arriving, so Huck had missed out on his chance of a quiet moment in the parlor. The money was going to be buried with the man. unless someone had found out about it. Because in Huck's mind, if you stood at the right angle, you surely would see that there was a bag just barely hidden from sight. Huck couldn't be sure because he never got close to the coffin before it was closed up and put 6 feet under. He panicked, but he took comfort in at least one thing. The king and the duke wouldn't get their grubby hands on it now. And the day after the funeral, the king wasted no time starting to sell every item of their inheritance. They had created another dubious layer to their lie that wouldn't raise suspicions of them trying to sell everything so fast. Because they were going to take the girls to England to live with them. The 2 older ones were ecstatic, but Joanna still looked suspicious. But the auctions began as soon as the sun was up the day after the funeral, and the first thing to go was the slaves. In his eagerness, King made one mistake that was the first real blemish on his reputation with the girls. In an effort to maximize profits, or at least a carelessness for detail, he sold the boy slaves to a plantation upriver, and their mother was sent down south. The girls were heartbroken to see the family broken up like this, and the 3 of them cried together with their slave companions before they were trucked off to their new homes. But the girls remained in a depressed state as King cheerfully continued taking offers and bids on the rest of the property. Huck watched this unfold with curiosity. Was King's greed going to be his undoing? The word started spreading around town, and it was more than just the girls who found it scandalous to split up a family like that, even if they were slaves. The next day, King and Duke cornered Huck and interrogated him about the gold. Apparently, they had finally looked for it again and found it was gone. When he said he didn't know where it was, they asked if he'd seen anybody else go in there. Huck's mind raced, trying to come up with a believable answer. Well, I saw the slaves go in there several times. He was quite pleased with this response because it was both believable and also, since the slaves had already been sold and taken away, the 2 cons couldn't investigate that lead any further. Luckily for Huck, Duke and King took the bait. They began cursing the slaves and almost admiring how smoothly they'd pulled off this caper. And we sold them for a song, King said in awe of how much he'd underestimated them. But now the 2 were even more committed to selling every item and asset that good George Wilkes had left to his brothers in the will. They had to make their money back somehow. The longer this dragged out, the worse Huck felt for the girls, and the more inclined he was to do something about it. So, once when he was walking past Mary Jane's room, he saw her sitting by the open trunk that she was half-heartedly packing, shoulders slouched, looking awfully sad. So, Huck asked her what was the matter. It turned out to be the slaves. It still didn't sit right with her how they'd been separated. They'll never see each other again, she sobbed. In that moment, finding this kind and well-intentioned girl, I know, well-intentioned by slave owner standards. We're not comparing this to modern mindsets. But anyway, well-intentioned girl, finding her so desperate and sad, Huck made up his mind to do something about it. He tells her the family will see each other again, and he knows it. He was kind of shocked at himself for speaking so resolutely for something he didn't really have a plan for yet, but Mary Jane hugged him and asked him to say that again. When she asked him to know how that could be the case, he took a deep breath and formulated his plan. Mary Jane, you got some place you can stay for 3 or 4 days? She named some family friend that she should be able to stay with, but asks why. I'll tell you in a bit, but if you want to get your slaves back, you've got to go away for a few days. He closed and locked her door before he broke the news to her. Now, don't make a sound, he said in quiet tones. This is going to be hard to take. He paused, the way you do before finally committing to the thing you know you should have done a long time ago. Those men aren't your uncles. They're a couple of deadbeat frauds. There, the worst of it was out. Mary Jane's eyes went wide. She gasped and then flushed with embarrassment at the thought of how much she had publicly adored these men with all the trust in her heart. She stood up. Why, we can't waste a minute. I'll have them tarred and feathered. Huck pulled at her arm and got her to sit back down. Of course you will, but for now, you gotta go stay with Mr. Lothrop like you agreed to. Mary Jane scrunched up her face, but remembering her commitment to help Huck, she sat down to listen to the rest of it. He told her how he had been forced to share a raft with the men and was kind of a prisoner himself for the time. He was still formulating how he could pull this off. He needed to get King and Duke jailed so he could leave with Jim, but they couldn't float down the river in daytime without those 2 men to pose as slave catchers, so he needed this plan to kick into gear at nighttime. Actually, he said, you may not need to stay at Lothrop's for more than a few hours. Head over there now and come back around 9:30 p.m. When you're home, put a candle in the window so I know you're back. If you light a candle and I don't show up, that means I'm gone and safe, which is when you can alert the authorities to these frauds. But if for some reason I do get lumped in with them when justice comes knocking, can I trust you to speak up for me?" "Why, of course," she said. "I won't let them touch you." "But why do I have to go away even for today?" she asked. "Because, Mary Jane, I couldn't ask for a better book than your face. I could sit and read it all day. Now that you know the truth about your uncles, do you really think you can go a full day without looking at them funny and giving them the tip that they need to skedaddle?" She thought for a moment before saying she supposes Huck is right. So she set off immediately. But not before Huck awkwardly told her where he believed the gold bag was to be found. He felt bad suggesting that she'd have to dig up her beloved uncle to claim the money, but he had to let her know. And as she readied herself to leave, she told Huck she'd never forget him and that she would pray for him every day. Quote, "Pray for me." I reckoned if she'd known me, she'd take a job that was nearer her size. With Mary Jane gone and a schedule for his escape, Huck felt like he'd figured everything out right pretty. Maybe even Tom Sawyer would have been proud of him. He spent the afternoon hanging out around the auction that was ongoing. He knew that King and Duke would be less suspicious of him if they could see him sitting around. The afternoon dragged on slowly until, up from the docks, there started to be some crowd noises. The group of people found their way up to the auction block. People were yelling, others laughing, and acting like they were going to see a show, when one of them yelled out, "Here's your opposition line. Here's your 2 sets of heirs to old Peter Wilkes, and you pays your money and you takes your choice." And in the center of the crowd were 2 men, dressed in the English fashion, looking confused as could be. There was one older, more distinguished-looking man and a nice-looking younger brother who had an arm in a sling. Huck's eyes shot to his traveling companions and was amazed how unshocked they looked. They were well versed in not giving up the game before it was absolutely lost. The crowd settled down as the older man began to speak in a much better English accent than King's, saying he was not prepared for something like this, because their luggage, along with any identifying documents, were dropped off by the steamboat a town upriver from here, and his poor brother broke his arm on their travels, so he is unable to sign at the moment. But he guarantees that they are who they say they are, and they will prove it. But for the time being, they will be at the hotel. King tried to seed doubts into the crowd's mind, saying how convenient it was for the deaf and mute brother's arm to be broken, and that they lost their luggage along with any identifying documents. Some of the crowd laughed along with King, others still looked suspicious. The doctor finally spoke up again after sitting in silence the last couple days, and swayed a few others into his belief that he couldn't say for sure if the new ones were frauds, but these 2, he said, menacingly pointing at King and Duke, "these 2 sure ain't the Wilkes brothers." The crowd was working itself up into a kind of mob that ended up ushering everyone into the grand room of the hotel, where a kind of makeshift trial was set up with both sets of brothers and the lawyer, Levi Bell, asking questions to try and determine who were the fakes. It started by someone saying that if the first pair of brothers weren't really frauds, surely they would have no hesitation to give up the money the girls had entrusted to them until this was all sorted out. King responded by surprisingly sticking to Huck's story, saying that the slaves had stolen it before being sold a couple days back. He offers to let anyone search their rooms if they aren't satisfied, which, of course, since the money was truly gone, it was very clever of him to offer that up. But that doesn't mean people fully believed him. The lawyer suggested that King write a note to be delivered to the house saying that he gives permission for his quarters to be searched. But after King scrawled out a couple lines, the lawyer instead turns to the other Harvey Wilkes and asks him to write a few lines down on a paper. Once that was done, the lawyer sprung his trap. He pulls out a handful of letters written from Harvey to his brother George. Now, all they had to do was match up the handwriting. The crowd oohed and awed at the brilliant move. King looked a little ill, but the lawyer's face looked baffled as he compared the 3 writing samples, because while King's hand definitely didn't look like the letters, neither did the other guys. The older man said he could explain. He has notoriously bad handwriting, so it is his brother William who scribes his letters, but conveniently, it was the broken arm that he wrote with. King and Duke breathed a little easier, although this event may have just made both of them look equally fraudulent. But as the crowd began to murmur, the second Harvey Wilkes thought of something. "I know," he exclaimed. "I know how to prove it." Turning to the crowd, he asked if anyone here had been part of his brother's burial preparations. An old man said he had been one of the men to prep the body. "Excellent," said Harvey too. He turned to King and said, "If you are the real Harvey Wilkes, surely you can tell me what he had tattooed upon his breast." King froze stiff in that moment. He hemmed and hawed as the crowd watched silently. Why, yes, I can tell you what was tattooed on his breast. It's just a small, thin, blue arrow. That's what it was." The crowd whispered for a moment before the other Harvey beamed triumphantly, saying, "There, you heard it." He was looking at the old mortician again. "Did you see such a mark on his breast?" The old man said, "No." "Excellent," Harvey too proclaimed. "That's because the tattoo on his chest is simply his initials, P.B.W. That's what you saw, wasn't it?" he said. The man looked confused and said, "No, we didn't. We never saw any tattoos on him at all." The crowd erupted. The lawyer looked flabbergasted. There were cries to jail all four of them. Some had more violent suggestions, but the lawyer calmed the people down and said there was one way to resolve this. "Let's go dig up the body." The crowd turned into a mob really quickly, and all four men were grabbed and tied at the wrists. Huck was also imprisoned in such a fashion. Huck's heart raced as he wondered what was going to happen to him. Would they find any tattoo on the chest? Was the gold going to be discovered? Would he die simply because he didn't run away fast enough? And here's a funny little paragraph that feels like Twain poking fun at the lack of thinking that goes on in a mob mentality. Because, quote, "When they got there, they swarmed into the graveyard and washed over it like an overflow. And when they got to the grave, they found they had about 100 times as many shovels as they wanted, but nobody hadn't thought to fetch a lantern. But they sailed into digging anyway by the flicker of the lightning and sent a man off to the nearest house, a half-mile off, to borrow one." So everybody wanted to be part of the digging, and nobody thought about how late it was until they already got to the graveyard and it was super dark. But Huck forgot to breathe about a dozen times as the hole got deeper and deeper. There were enough men in the crowd that they could swap out as soon as anyone was tired, which meant that 6 feet didn't take very long. The coffin was dug up and they unscrewed the lid. As the moment of the reveal approached, everyone in the crowd pushed to the front to get a look. Even the man holding Huck's rope was pulling so tightly that it hurt Huck's wrists. Just as the lid was being lifted off, a large, fanning bolt of lightning filled the scene with bright white light. "What's this?" someone yelled. "Here's the bag of gold sitting on his chest." The crowd roared and pushed in to see. The man holding Huck's rope let go as he was desperate to see the bag of gold for himself. And with that, Huck was off. Not a single person in the mob was looking at anything but the uncovered coffin, so he slipped away unnoticed. He ran down the road in the storm, his feet splashing in the puddles already forming in the road. When he got back to town, everything was dark. Apparently, the whole town was part of the mob. He ran past the Wilkes house and glanced up into Mary Jane's window to see there was a candle lit. That was all he needed to know. He was out of here. Mary Jane would corroborate his story, and he could trust that King and Duke would be sent to jail, while he could get off innocent. It was time to split. He ran down to the spot where poor Jim had been hiding for almost a week at this point, all on his own, and he yelled for his friend to cast off. They were out of here. Jim tried to hug Huck and tell him how glad he was to see him, but Huck said they didn't have time. "We can talk about that later. We have to go now." They had just pushed the raft off the shore and were heading out into the current when Huck heard a sound that terrified him. It was the King and the Duke chasing after them, their hands still tied. The raft was still in shallow enough water that the two men would surely catch them. The plan had failed. Quote, "So I wilted right down on the planks then and give up, and it was all I could do to keep from crying." Once on board, King started letting into Huck about how he was trying to give them the slip. Huck spun a story about how the man holding his rope had felt sorry for him and let him go because he didn't want to see a boy get strung up, and how he would have tried to save them, but there was nothing he could do. The king didn't believe him, but luckily Duke stepped in and said either one of them would have done the same thing in the boy's situation. There's no use in blaming him. Huck untied the men's hands, and they all sat in silence for a minute before King let out a humph. And to think we thought the slaves had stole that money. This leads to a humorous no honor among thieves moment where King and Duke slowly start blaming each other for having stolen the money to keep it all for themselves. Tempers flare and suspicions only resolve when both of them admit that that had been their plan, but they swear that they hadn't actually done anything about it. And in the wake of all this, they do the math and lament the fact that they had arrived in this town with almost $600 and were on the verge of making it out with upwards of $20,000, but now we're leaving it with less than they got here with. Because remember, they had to use $400 of their own cash to fill the gap in the buried gold. Quote, so the king sneaked into the wigwam and took to his bottle for comfort. And before long, the Duke tackled his bottle, and so in about half an hour, they was as thick as thieves again, and the tighter they got, the lovinger they got, and went off a-snoring in each other's arms. They both got powerful mellow, but I noticed the king didn't get mellow enough to forget to remember to not deny about hiding the money bag again. That made me feel easy and satisfied. Of course, when they got to snoring, we had a long gabble, and I told Jim everything. A few days downstream, they start pulling out into every small town so King and Duke can run some quick scams to recoup some money. They preached lectures on temperance, they opened up a dancing school, they also tried teaching elocution, which is the skill of clear and distinct pronunciation. Twain had fun with it by having Huck spell it wrong as yellocution, which the two men failed at very quickly. At a certain point, King suggested they should be far enough away that they could try the camel leopard again, since that had been their most successful gambit. They pulled the raft in a mile downstream from a bigger town called Pikesville. King told Duke to stay with the others while he scouted out the town to see if they'd caught wind of the scam they'd run a couple hundred miles up the river. He said if by midday he hadn't returned, that meant he was finding luck there, and Duke should bring Huck along with him. Midday passed, and Duke dragged Huck into town where they found King drunk as a skunk. Duke and King began to argue, and King kept blabbering about how he'd found a way to make some quick cash, but he didn't say how. The two men got into a big enough squabble that Huck seized his chance. He ran back to the raft, yelling for Jim to shove off. Except Jim wasn't there. Huck panicked. Where had he gone? Huck found another boy fishing nearby, and he asked if he'd seen a man that fit Jim's description. The boy said he had. He'd been picked up by several men who were going to claim the $200 bounty on him. He overheard some of the men saying how an old man had claimed to have the slave, but couldn't be bothered to make his way down to Orleans, and he'd sell his claim to the men for $40. Huck felt so angry inside. That's what the king had done. You know where they took him? Huck asked. Yeah, it was some of them Phelps family who bought his bounty, so he'll surely be locked up at the Phelps farm. Huck went back to the raft and skulked. What was he supposed to do? He loathed the old man more than ever before. He'd sold out Jim for a measly $40 so he could get drunk. Huck pondered his options. In his mind, now that Jim was captured, he was going to be a slave for the rest of his life. So maybe the best option would be to write to the widow Douglas, Miss Watson, or Tom Sawyer so they could claim Jim, and at least he'd be a slave near his family instead of down in New Orleans. But he figured now that Jim would forever be labeled as a runaway slave, and that the widow would just sell him downriver anyway. And quote, and if I own up to it, I'll be labeled as the boy who helped a slave try to escape. Here he was, wrestling with the morality of what he'd been taught was right versus what he actually felt. Quote, that's just the way. A person does a low-down thing, and then he don't want to take no consequences for it. Thinks as long as he can hide, it ain't no disgrace. That was my fix exactly. Briefly, he landed on the side of believing that this is what he got for helping steal a poor old woman's property from her. This was divine providence creating his reckoning. This was God telling Huck Finn that he'd been watching his sinful deeds all along. Huck tried to rationalize that feeling, saying he'd been brought up by a wicked man. How could he know any better? But his mind dismantled that objection, saying he had the option to go to Sunday school, but he'd skipped out almost every week. Quote, it made me shiver, and I about made up my mind to pray and see if I couldn't try to quit being the kind of boy I was and be better. So I kneeled down, but the words wouldn't come. Why wouldn't they? It weren't no use to try and hide it from him, nor from me neither. I knowed very well why they wouldn't come. It was because my heart weren't right. It was because I weren't square. It was because I was playing double. I was letting on to give up sin, but away inside of me, I was holding on to the biggest one of all. I was trying to make my mouth say I would do the right thing and the clean thing and go and right to that slave's owner and tell him where he was. But deep down in me, I knowed it was a lie. And he knowed it. You can't pray a lie. I found that out. Now, I don't know if Twain did this on purpose, but that line is basically a twin to the final lines in Hamlet Act 3, Scene 3, where Claudius tries to pray about his repentance, but realizes his heart's not in it. Quote, "My words fly up, my thoughts remain below. Words without thoughts never to heaven go." So Huck decides to try writing the letter first and see if after he'd done that, he could try to pray for real. So he got a piece of paper and a pencil out from one of the bags and wrote, "Miss Watson, your runaway slave Jim is down here 2 miles below Pikesville, and Mr. Phelps has got him, and he will give him up for the reward if you send. Signed, Huck Finn." For a brief moment, Huck felt light as a feather. Maybe this was the right thing to do after all. He began to think maybe he wasn't doomed to hell if he could do this right thing. But then he started having memories of the past weeks and months, the time on the river with Jim, the adventures, the laughs, the jokes, the times that Jim looked hopeful that he might just make a new start and eventually be able to reunite his family. That was the thought that stung the most. Now, Jim would never be with his family again. And suddenly, the heaviness in his gut returned. Quote, "How is a boy supposed to know what's the right thing to do when every choice feels bad?" Jim had told him oftentimes that he was the only real friend he'd ever had, and here he was, about to condemn him to a miserable existence. His hands shook as he held the letter. I was a-tremblin', because I'd got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, "All right then, I'll go to hell," and tore it up. It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they was said, and I let them stay said, and never thought no more about reforming. I shoved the whole thing out of my head and said I would take up wickedness again, which was in my line, being brung up to it. And for a starter, I would go to work and steal Jim out of slavery again, and if I could think up anything worse, I would do that too, because as long as I was in, and in for good, I might as well go the whole hog. He then grabbed the essential supplies off the raft and returned to the boy who was fishing, asking for directions to the Phelps place. He looked over his shoulder back to the town where King and Duke were surely concocting some other way to make money off of poor folk, and he said good riddance as he spat on the ground. He may be a sinner, destined for hell, but at least he wasn't like those men. Okay, we have reached a very interesting and controversial part of the story. Not in terms of, like, racism. I mean from a literary perspective, because for most of the rest of the book, almost 1/4 of the total chapters in this novel, we dramatically shift tone and theme. And I'll be honest, it does so in a way that as a reader, I didn't like that much. And I'm not alone either, but there are plenty of people who say this was not a flaw in Twain's approach, but a deliberate choice, which we'll touch on after I've shared what happens. There are so many opinions on these chapters, but I just didn't want to dive into them very deeply because although I actually do find value from the protagonist lens in some of it, the value for me isn't enough to justify like 9 chapters of the book. So I am going to be very brief in my coverage of what happens. Then we'll discuss the ideas around why it's so contentious. And yes, this is the first time I think I've been this critical of more than just a single choice that an author made. Who would have thought that Mark Twain would have been the one to rile me up like this? And I guess the last thing before we do get into it, I don't believe he made this choice out of ignorance or bad storytelling. He's too sharp for that, but he never explicitly stated why he did it this way, and so it's left up to debatable interpretation by readers and literary scholars and podcasters today. So here we go. So to set up this whole section, Huck works his way to the Phelps estate. He is trying to scout the location, but is seen by a slave woman who beams when she sees him. "It's you! At last! You arrived!" Huck just said, yes, it is me, because if he had said no, he'd likely just get chased off the property. The slave brings him to the house and says their visitor has arrived. A woman comes in and beams at him, saying she's so happy to see him. Apparently, they were expecting a nephew of theirs to stay with them for a time, and apparently hadn't seen him in so long that nobody knew what he looked like. They started peppering him with questions about the family and life upriver. Huck kind of panicked. His lying abilities weren't ready for this level of focused attention from this woman, asking all of these specific questions. He was about ready to give up when the woman's husband arrived. He looked at Huck with a bit of disdain and said, "Who's this?" The words that the woman spoke next changed Huck's fear into relief instantly. "Why, it's your nephew, Tom Sawyer." Huck thought he might slump to the floor when he heard that. Of all the people, what are the odds? Yeah, even this is like massive convenience for plot development, right? But this isn't the part I struggle with. So Huck uses his vast knowledge of Tom Sawyer's life to bluff his way through that night with stories of people from back in St. Petersburg, and when they said they hadn't been expecting him until the next day, he made up a story on the fly about why his travel plans had changed. But that did give him the reason to set out the next morning early and intercept his friend when he arrived at the docks. When Huck first reveals himself, Tom thinks he's seeing a ghost, because remember, he hasn't seen his friend since the town decided that Jim had killed the boy and run away. Huck proves he's flesh and bone and lightly fills him in on the situation. And well, with what we know of Tom Sawyer, he loves the idea of running a scam, so he tells Huck to continue playing at Tom Sawyer and leave the rest to him. When they arrive at the Phelps farm, Tom introduces himself as Sid, Tom's brother. His aunt is happy to see him but acts surprised, saying that she hadn't been expecting Sid, and Tom acted like that was the whole point all along. Aunt Sally was delighted to have him as well, and quickly both boys were welcomed into the Phelps household. And now that Huck was a welcome guest under the guise of being Tom Sawyer, he could start sorting out his plan about how to rescue Jim. But pretty quickly, Huck realizes that Tom Sawyer, adventure reader and fully committed romancer of the tale, was not going to let this be done the easy way. Because when they find that Jim is being kept in a small hut that is locked day and night while the Phelps try to contact his owners, which is a fictional owner that Duke had made up for the handbill, Huck comes up with a plan. They'll take his canoe and park it close to the hut where Jim is being kept, and after everyone is asleep, they'll steal the old man's keys to get him out and escape by water before anyone realizes he's gone. "That'll work, won't it?" Huck asked Tom. "Work? Why, certainly it would work. Like rats a-fightin'. But it's too blame simple. There ain't nothing to it. What's the good of a plan that ain't no more trouble than that? It's as mild as goose milk. Why, Huck, it wouldn't make no more talk than breaking into a soap factory." Tom says they need a more daring plan and starts spitting out some ideas that at first Huck is mesmerized by, just like he always was when Tom Sawyer spun a tale. There's a brief moment where Huck struggles with the fact that Tom Sawyer, a boy who had been raised proper, seemed so eager to jailbreak a slave. Because Huck had accepted his own fate and justified it because he wasn't raised right. But seeing Tom so eager to break the law and help Jim felt odd. It almost made him think less of Tom. But it didn't change his resolve to get Jim out, even if it meant eternal damnation for himself. Huck said, "What if we sawed him out like I done the time when I was killed?" Tom's eyes lit up. "That's more like it. It's real mysterious and troublesome. That's good. But I bet we can come up with something even better. We ain't in no hurry. Let's keep thinking." They visit Jim with the slave who was responsible for feeding him, and Jim initially calls them Huck and Tom, which raises the slave's eyebrows a bit. But when the boys tell their friend that he is mistaken, he's quick enough to catch on, and they gaslight the slave, who is portrayed as very vulnerable and superstitious in the book, into thinking he had imagined the whole interaction. They manage one brief moment with Jim before the door is locked again, and they tell him they're gonna break him out, but he can't ever let on that he knows them. Jim grabbed their hands and thanked them, and like that, they were off. And here's where things really go off the rails for many readers. We then spend several chapters with Tom purposefully making the jailbreak more convoluted than could possibly be necessary. For example, he says they'll dig a tunnel to break him out, but at first he says they shouldn't use picks and shovels. That's not good enough for a story. They'll use knives. After 1 hour's worth of digging with kitchen utensils under the cover of night, he relents that maybe knives were a bad idea. But they can't just dig him out and leave without a trace. Some of his additional ideas are to cut the leg off the bed that Jim was chained to, even though they could just as easily lift the bed and remove the chain. He wanted Jim to write a manifesto of sorts that would be left behind for people to discover, and then they had to make him a coat of arms. Jim didn't know how to write, though, so Tom wrote the whole thing down and just told Jim to do the best he could to scratch that out on the wall. Here's the full manifesto in all 4 iterations that Tom kept starting and stopping on. 1. Here a captive heart busted. And then 2. Here a poor prisoner forsook by the world and friends fretted his sorrowful life. And then the 3rd one. Here a lonely heart broke and a worn spirit went to its rest after 37 years of solitary captivity. And then the final one that he stuck with. Here, homeless and friendless after 37 years of bitter captivity, perished a noble stranger, natural son of Louis XIV. This goes on and on with Huck not seeing any sense in what Tom wants to do, but not wanting to challenge his friend openly. They steal so many items from the house to use in their schemes that Aunt Sally starts to think she's losing her mind. And poor Jim has no clue what's going on. But since Tom and Huck have told him they're trying to help him escape, he doesn't dare question any of their methodology despite none of it making real sense. And trust me, I am leaving out at least half a dozen additional things that are not helpful in any way. But I've shared enough to get the point across. And if all of these seemingly unnecessary steps weren't enough for Tom's wild imagination, he decided there still wasn't enough drama to make this a truly daring escape. So he writes an anonymous letter that they slipped under the door at night. All it said was, "Beware, trouble is brewing. Keep a sharp lookout. Signed, Unknown Friend." The next night, Tom used some animal blood to draw a skull and crossbones on the door, which sent his aunt and uncle into a real frenzy, but Tom just smiled. Now things were just about right for a real adventurous jailbreak. He wrote one more letter to set the stage to make this the greatest adventure he'd ever lived. Here's what the last letter said. "Don't betray me. I wish to be your friend. There is a desperate gang of cutthroats from over in Indian territory going to steal your runaway slave tonight. And they have been trying to scare you so as you will stay in the house and not bother them. I am one of the gang, but have got religion and wish to quit and lead an honest life again, and will betray the hellish design. They will sneak down from northwards along the fence at exactly midnight with a false key and go in the slave's cabin to get him. I am to be off a piece and blow a tin horn if I see any danger, but instead of that, I will baa like a sheep soon as they get in and not blow at all. Then, whilst they are getting his chains loose, you slip there and lock them in, and can kill them at your leisure. Don't do anything but just the way I am telling you. If you do, they will suspicion something and raise whoop jamboree hoo. I do not wish any reward, but to know that I have done the right thing. Signed, Unknown Friend." What Huck had not anticipated, because who knows what Tom Sawyer expected to happen, but that night of the planned escape, there were a dozen farmers with guns in the Phelps household. Huck felt a massive knot in his stomach, but Sawyer seemed almost giddy. "Ain't this bully?" he whispered to Huck upstairs while they spied on the mini militia in the living room. "Why, I bet if we did it again, I could get upwards of 200 men here with guns. If we could just put it off until—" Huck cut him off. "No, Tom, we got to do this tonight." All right, he said, feeling put out. They snuck out of a second-story window and took the long way around to the hut. They couldn't risk being spotted by anyone watching from the house. They quietly snuck Jim out of the tunnel they had dug, pausing frequently as they heard men talking about how the door was still locked. One of the voices told the others to spread out and find hiding places. Once they didn't hear any voices or steps, they let out again, stooping low and holding their breath until they made it to the fence line. Jim and Huck made it over the fence just fine, but Tom's pants got caught on a splinter. They heard steps approaching, so he wrenched his leg free, causing a noise. "Who's there?" a voice shouted. "Answer or I'll shoot." But they were too far gone now. They all took off running without a word. Bang, 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 a series of shots were fired into the darkness around them. A voice yelled to the others saying he'd found them. "Let the dogs loose." The boys and Jim legged it as fast as they could. The barks of the hounds closed in on them, but the boys knew how to handle this. They were, after all, just his aunt and uncle's dogs, who knew them and played with them all the time. So when they ran ahead of the men and found Huck and Tom, they quieted down very quickly, and they kept running as if they must be looking for something else. The boys and Jim worked their way down to the water, and once there, Huck beamed as he looked up at Jim and told him he was a free man again. Jim was grinning and holding back tears as he thanked the two of them profusely, saying it had been a masterful plan. Tom was grinning ear to ear, but he would wince every once in a while, and it was only then that Huck noticed Tom had taken a bullet in his leg. So Huck and Jim laid him out on the tent in the raft and tried to tie his leg up to stop the bleeding. Tom was telling them to not waste time on him. The evasion is going so handsome, he said eagerly. Man the sweeps. Let her loose, boys. We done it elegant. Indeed we did. If we'd been in France, we could have saved Louis XVI from the guillotine, no doubt. Jim and Huck were looking at each other nervously, though. Huck could tell something was on Jim's mind. Say it, Jim, he said. Jim says that he wouldn't feel right to make an escape without getting Tom a doctor, and he ain't leaving until the boy's been taken care of. This alleviated Huck's concerns because that was exactly what he was worried about. If they set sail and Tom's bullet wound got infected, he might die. And when they made the plan known, Tom objected in the strongest of terms, but he couldn't even stand up, so his opinion didn't carry much weight. So Huck took the canoe and with some direction from Tom on where to find a doctor, set out to save his friend. The sounds of men yelling and hounds barking filled the air as he floated off, and when Huck reached the doctor, an old man who took a bit to wake up from his sleepy stupor, the boy concocted another story about how his friend and he had been sleeping while holding a gun and his friend had accidentally shot himself. The doctor grabbed his medicine bag, but as soon as he saw Huck's small canoe, he said he wouldn't be able to float in that thing along with Huck, who he knew as Tom, just remember that. He says he'll look for a bigger canoe, but Huck says there's not time and tells the doctor to take the canoe himself and instructs him on where to find the raft. Once the doctor was on his way, Huck's adrenaline tapped out and he found himself desperate to shut his eyes for just a minute. When he woke up the next morning, the doctor hadn't returned yet, which didn't look good for Tom. So Huck was hunting around for another canoe that he could use to find his friend when he ran into his uncle, Silas, his fake uncle, so Tom's real uncle. Huck answers his uncle's question about what he's doing here, saying that he's just been out all night hunting for the runaway slave. Silas tells him that his aunt is worried sick and he's taking him back before setting out to keep a lookout for Sid. When they got back to the Phelps home, the place was chaotic. Slaves were running around everywhere at Aunt Sally's command, looking in every corner of the property for Tom or Sid, or even a clue about where they were. She crushed Huck in a hug as he walked through the door, but peppered him with questions about Sid. In the background, there were neighbors losing their minds over the sheer scale of this attack from the previous night. Some said there must have been 20 men, if not 40, helping that slave escape, but no one understood why. Huck was deeply unsettled. He didn't know what was going on with Tom or Jim, and he didn't have any satisfying answers for Aunt Sally's questions. She was coming undone with her nephew missing. The house was so full of noise from neighbors who weren't being helpful, and it was like this all day. And by nightfall, there still was no sign of Tom or Jim. Huck couldn't sleep, and he went downstairs thinking he was going to try to find them himself. But when he got downstairs, Aunt Sally was sitting up in a chair, looking out of the window to the front, hoping that she'd see her nephew come walking in. She looked sadder than any woman Huck had ever seen in his life, and he wasn't that good at hiding from her. When she saw him, she didn't scold or chastise. She just smiled and said the door's not locked and she knows he can get down by the lightning rod if he wants anyway. But won't he be a good boy and go to sleep? For her sake? Huck wanted to go find Tom real bad, but after looking in Sally's eyes and knowing that there was plenty of people looking for Tom, he decided to not break her heart any further. The next morning finally brought the relief that everyone had hoped for. Tom Sawyer, aka Sid, was being pulled on a mattress by a horse towards the front door, the doctor and Jim walking on either side of him. Aunt Sally ran out to him, screaming that he was dead when she saw his motionless body, but Tom squirmed just a tiny bit so she knew he was alive, and she thanked God. She had other slaves help her bring Tom into the house. Huck stayed outside just long enough to see what would be done to Jim. The men from town were quick to tie him up, saying they'd lock him up and keep him under guard until he was claimed. Some said that wasn't good enough, that they should lynch him right there. All of them swore up and down at the now twice escaped slave. Jim just stood there silently, staring at the ground, so as to not look too defiant. They chained him up, arms and legs, and said he wouldn't be giving anything but bread and water for the rest of his time here. It was only when the old doctor got involved that the tone changed. He said to not be too hard on the man. He's not a bad Negro. He described how he had arrived on the scene, and he realized he would need help removing the bullet from the leg. It didn't help that the boy was combative and a little delirious. Apparently Tom wouldn't let the doctor near him. He had almost given up and said to the boy that he would have to go find help and return later to remove the bullet. But that was when this man came walking out of the trees and offered to help. The doctor goes on to say that Jim did nothing except for what the doctor told him to do for the next 24 hours. He's a faithful one, all right. I tell you, gentlemen, a slave like that's worth $1,000, and better treatment, too. Even when they made their journey back to the Phelps farm, Jim came willingly. The group of men softened up a bit and apologized for their threats and coarse language, and then proceeded to lock Jim up anyway. Okay, I know this is mid-chapter, but this is the cleanest breaking point, in my opinion, before the very end of the story, which we are close to, where I can now address the issues I mentioned earlier. And you may be thinking, J-Mo, it sure feels like you've told the whole story. Was that really that much of a summarization? The answer is yes, because the part specifically about Tom romanticizing the jailbreak I wrote in maybe 300 to 500 words, when in the book it's like 6 full chapters. And it just didn't resonate with me, because when you read it in full detail of the book, it sure feels like Huck takes a back seat to Tom suddenly, after we've spent 30 chapters coming to love and appreciate the bold and curious nature of Huck Finn. Suddenly, he's a side character in his own story who just does whatever Tom tells him to do. Not to mention, those who object to this book on the grounds of the dehumanization of Jim hate these chapters because Jim's life is put into danger just because a boy wanted a better story to tell. And you remember how I opened this story with a quote from Ernest Hemingway? Well, he might agree with me, or maybe he doesn't. I'll explain. Because the same essay where Hemingway said that all modern American literature comes from this one book, he went on to say that if you read it, you must stop where Jim is stolen from the boys, saying that that is the real end. The rest is just cheating. Now, through the years, many have interpreted that to mean the chapter where Jim is sold for $40 to the Phelps family. And in terms of the emotional weight, that is a very strong point in the story to contend with. Because after spending all of the book to that point going back and forth on whether helping Jim was the right thing to do, Huck has finally decided, all right then, I'll go to hell. Which gives us this deep sense of growth in him as a character. He's fully picked a side he believes will get him sent to hell, but he believes he is doing the right thing. And then after that, we shift gears into this preteen fever dream from a boy who's read too many adventure novels. It's like a punch in the face to me. But there are those that point to Hemingway's use of the word stolen from the boys as proof that he didn't mean the book should have ended where I just described, but that rather it should have ended right here. Because the earlier event in the book, where many people have thought Hemingway meant, there are no boys. It's just Huck. Those people would argue that Hemingway would have loved the mischievous chapters of Tom's derailing, and there's no way he would have taken them out. Now, we'll get to the end very soon, and you can see what Hemingway himself could have meant by cheating if indeed it was just these final pages that he wanted removed. But, like I said, despite how I feel about the chapters personally, I don't believe Twain was ignorant about what he was doing. But all of this is to point to the one thing I have learned about Mark Twain that I believe drove him to push the story in this direction for the third act. He hated romanticism with a passion, specifically the chivalry, love stories of knights and honor and slaying dragons and saving princesses. He felt like it made people treat real life in a way that was harmful on the whole, and gave everyone dreams of being as beloved and as important as the heroes of those tales. He might have disliked other types of romance-era fiction as well, but for the purpose of dissecting Tom Sawyer, this covers it well enough. Twain goes as far as to blame one popular romantic adventure author of a very popular novel about knights for causing the Civil War to happen. I'm not going to get into it here, but if you have signed up for the protagonist edition of the show, we are getting very into those details in the show notes. Link in the episode description if you want to sign up for that, by the way. But his entire shtick with Tom Sawyer is essentially to make fun of that genre of literature, because in essence, he uses Tom Sawyer the same way Cervantes uses Don Quixote, to poke fun at the very types of stories that he thought were pointless, uninspiring, and generally harmful to impressionable minds. So it is very possible that Twain knew exactly what he was doing by taking what should have been a serious moment, trying to save a man's life, and muddle it up with a boy who can't separate fact from fiction because he is too in love with the idea of living a great adventure. Possibly he wanted us readers to roll our eyes at Tom's shenanigans while poor Jim is inching closer and closer to a terrible end, so that we would feel the disdain for the stories that have turned Tom Sawyer into this narrative-driven lunatic. But I'll wrap this up by saying, I didn't want to give those chapters the time they would have taken if I'd told them faithfully, because they don't serve the development of our character, Huck Finn. Like I said, he takes a back seat in his own story. But with that, let's wrap up this story, shall we? So with Jim locked up but safe, Huck finally went inside to check on Tom. The boy was unconscious most of that day, but by the next morning, he was awake and chatty. When Huck found him in his room, Tom, who was still playing Sid, was asking about Jim. Huck couldn't bear to tell him that their friend was back in a locked room, so he just said, "He's fine," and Tom beamed at the news. "And we're both back safe. Splendid. Did you tell Auntie?" Huck looked at Tom with a sort of, "You really want to do this?" look before saying, "About what? Sid?" "The whole thing, of course." Aunt Sally was very eager to learn what he meant by this. "What whole thing?" And Tom launched right into telling the whole story about how he and Tom, at least he was keeping that part of the charade up, but how he and Tom had set the slave free. At first, Aunt Sally thought Sid was delirious, but Tom got almost angry as he wanted nothing more than to be given credit for a successful jailbreak. He tried to explain how they'd put so much work in over the past couple weeks, how many things they'd stolen from the house to help their cause, and how they even played tricks on her so she would think she was losing her mind when she thought she'd found the things were missing. Sally looked completely shocked as Sid/Tom then explained how they succeeded at getting Jim out, even with all those men around. He looked like he expected to be given a badge of honor for telling this story. But Sally about lost her mind. She told Tom to just sit until he was better so she could tan his hide. But Tom was so proud and so pleased with himself that he just started laughing. Aunt Sally told him he better enjoy it while he can, but that if she ever catches her boy meddling with him again— "Meddling with whom?" Tom interrupted. "With the runaway slave, of course." Tom's head whipped around to Huck as he said, "Didn't you just tell me he was all right? Didn't he get away?" Sally scoffed. "Get away? Indeed he didn't. He's back safe and sound, locked and under guard." Tom sat up in his bed, his eyes on fire. He yelled, "They ain't got no right to shut him up. Go tell them. Now. Don't lose a minute. Let him go. He ain't no slave. He's as free as any critter that walked the earth." Sally demanded to know what her nephew was talking about. Tom was trying to get out of bed. "If no one else won't go, I will. Old Miss Watson died 2 months ago, and she felt so guilty that she'd ever considered selling Jim that one of the last things she did was set him free in her will." Sally was even more perplexed. "Then why on earth did you want to break him out if you knew he was a free man?" Tom, with a smirk on his face, just looked around at Huck and said, "Ain't that just like a woman?" "Why, Aunt Sally, I wanted the adventure of it. Why, I ain't never felt so— Aunt Polly!" Huck and Aunt Sally turned quickly and were also stunned to see Aunt Polly, Tom Sawyer's guardian and Aunt Sally's sister, standing in the room. She called Tom by his rightful name, with a type of judgmental look in her eyes, and Aunt Sally broke down thinking that the boy had changed so much in her care that his own guardian didn't even realize this was Sid, not Tom. Huck had slipped out of the room as soon as he had a chance, and he heard Aunt Sally ask where Tom had gone. Aunt Polly corrected her, saying, "You mean where's Huck Finn? I ain't raised such a scamp as Tom Sawyer to not know him when I'm looking at him. Come back in here, Huck Finn." Huck walked into the room with his head down low. waiting for judgment to settle in. Quote, so Tom's Aunt Polly, she told all about who I was and what, and I had to up and tell how I was in such a tight place that when Mrs. Phelps took me for Tom Sawyer, she tipped in and says, oh, you can call me Aunt Sally. I'm used to it now. And 'tain't no need to change. Huck corrected himself politely and said, that's when Aunt Sally took me for Tom Sawyer. I had to stand it. There weren't no other way. And I knowed Tom wouldn't mind because it wouldn't be nuts for him, being a mystery, and he'd make an adventure out of it and be perfectly satisfied. And so it turned out as he let on be Sid and made things as soft as he could for me, and his Aunt Polly said Tom was right about old Miss Watson setting Jim free in her will, and so, sure enough, Tom Sawyer had gone and took all that trouble and bother to set a free slave free. And I could never understand before, until that very minute and that talk, how Tom could help a body set a slave free with his bringing up. With all this cleared up, Aunt Sally asked why she hadn't heard nothing from her sister ever since Sid had arrived. And then it came out that in order to guarantee their plans didn't get upset by the sisters communicating, Tom had been intercepting all letters that Aunt Polly had sent her sister since the day he arrived. And the book ends with a very brief chapter, so I'm just going to read this page or two to wrap up this tale. The first time I catched Tom private, I asked him what was his idea, time of the evasion. What it was he planned to do if the evasion worked all right and he managed to set a man free that was already free before. And he said what he had planned in his head from the start, if we got Jim out all safe, was for us to run him down the river on the raft and have adventures plumb to the mouth of the river, and then tell him about being set free and take him back up home on a steamboat in style and pay him for his lost time and ride word ahead and get out all the slaves around and have them waltz him into town with a torchlight procession and a brass band. And then he would be a hero, and so would we. But I reckon it was about as well the way it was. We had Jim out of the chains in no time, and when Aunt Polly and Uncle Silas and Aunt Sally found out how good he had helped the doctor nurse Tom back, they made a heap of fuss over him and fixed him up prime and give him all he wanted to eat and a good time and nothing to do. And we had him up to the sick room and had a high talk, and Tom give Jim $40 for being prisoner for us so patient and doing it up so good. And Jim was pleased most to death and busted out and says, there now, Huck, what I tell you up there at Jackson Island. I told you I got a hairy breast. I just realized I cut this part out. There's a scene when they're on Jackson Island near the beginning where Jim claims that having hairy chest and hairy arms is a sign that you'll be rich. And he claims that he was rich once, but he got swindled out of his money. But he promises Huck that he will be rich again. I totally forgot I didn't put that in the script. So let me give you that line again. There now, Huck, what I tell you up there on Jackson Island. I told you I got a hairy breast. And what's that sign of? I told you I've been rich once and I was gonna be rich again. And it come true. And here I is. There now. Don't talk to me. Signs is signs. Mind I tell you. And I know just as well that I was gonna be rich again. And I'm a-standing here this minute. And then Tom, he talked along and says, let's all three slide out of here one of these nights and get an outfit and go for howling adventures amongst the Injuns in the territory for a couple weeks or two. And I says, all right, that suits me, but I ain't got no money for it to buy the outfit. And I reckon I couldn't get none from home because it's likely Pap's been back before now and got it all away from Judge Thatcher and drunk it up. No, he ain't, Tom says. It's all there, $6,000 and more. And your Pap ain't ever been back since. Hadn't when I come anyhow. Jim says kinda solemn, he ain't a-comin' back no more, Huck. I says, why, Jim? Never mind, Huck, but he ain't coming back no more. But I kept at him. So at last he says, don't you remember the house that was floating down in the river and the way there was a man there kivered up and I went up and unkivered him and didn't let you come in? Well, you can get your money when you wants it, 'cause that was your Pap. And so, there ain't nothing more to write about. And I'm a-rotten glad of it, because if I'd knowed what a trouble it was to make a book, I wouldn't have tackled it. And ain't a-going to no more. But I reckon I got to light out for the territory ahead of the rest, because Aunt Sally says she's going to adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've been there before. So, now that you know Tom's dirty little secret, how do you feel? Are you even more frustrated with his boyish ignorance and desire for self-importing adventure? Or maybe you can feel the frustration as Twain likely intended. Either way, At least it does wrap up with a traditional happy ending, I guess. And before the final takeaway, a quick request that if you like hearing these stories and analysis but haven't subscribed or given the show 5 stars, please help a guy out and take 30 seconds to grow this audience. If you're on YouTube, like and drop me a comment about what you thought. And with that being said, let's talk about it. Okay, when it comes to a takeaway from this book, there's one scene that basically begs to be the center of a moral, right? I'm talking about the scene on the raft where Huck has written a letter to Miss Watson saying where Jim was. He believes this is the morally right thing to do, and yet he is sick with the feeling that he can't betray his friend and traveling companion like this. Let me reread just a couple paragraphs from that section. Quote, "I took it up and held it in my hand. I was a trembling because I'd got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell," and tore it up. It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they was said, and I let them stay said, and never thought no more about reforming. That line, all right then, I'll go to hell, hits hard. And on the surface level, it's easy to read that as saying Huck has decided that slavery is wrong. But that's not what he's doing at all. What he did is much deeper, more personal, and more terrifying, and I've got proof. Because what he's actually decided here is that he couldn't go on trying to juggle two things that he felt or believed because they were contradictory to each other, and that moment reflects him choosing which one he's sticking to. The choice he was making was between, do I do the right thing I've been taught is morally correct and required for me to go to heaven, versus do I allow my friend to be enslaved again, beaten, and never allowed to see his family? It wasn't taking a stance against the institution of slavery. It was a choice of what he personally wanted to be a part of. He's not saying, I'll go to hell flippantly, like, oh yeah, I know by making this choice I've been told that that's where I'm going, but I don't really believe it. In his mind, he is genuinely saying, if hell is real, I guess that's where I'm headed for choosing this. And I'm okay with that. And if you want proof that this is true, we don't need to look further than when Tom agrees to help him break Jim out just a few chapters later. Because when Tom eagerly agrees to help Huck, he says that he's shocked. He says that Tom Sawyer fell considerably in his estimation that day because Tom Sawyer was now a slave stealer, which means when it comes to what Huck believes is the moral upright thing to do, he still hasn't decided that slavery as an institution is wrong. He's just decided that he's the kind of guy who'd rather do what feels right to him than what authorities tell him he should be doing, even if there are severe consequences. He wasn't trying to classify his act as good. He just classified himself as the kind of person who would do what was wrong as long as it was to help someone he cared about. He was seemingly fully aware of the supposed cost of his action, which is why that line, all right then, I'll go to hell, has so much weight behind it. Because up to that point in the book, Huck has been very wishy-washy in a very Hamlet-like way. He has two opposing views that he's trying to reconcile in a way that makes him indecisive. For Hamlet, it was his feudal honor versus his Christian beliefs. For Huck, it was societal and Christian beliefs of the time mixed with personal relationships. Both characters go back and forth on what they should do, and each has a single moment where they finally make a choice. This scene we've talked about was Huck's. For Hamlet, it was watching a fellow prince, Fortinbras, march with an army of tens of thousands to fight for a worthless piece of land, and that helped him realize what a prince should be capable of. And instead, he has been running around debating internally if he should or shouldn't kill his father's murderer. And in both cases, they spent time debating what to do, time hoping and wishing that the matter would essentially resolve itself without them having to get their hands dirty. And that's where we should take these examples as a warning to us. The time spent not deciding does not exist in a vacuum. The clock is ticking. You are hurtling downriver towards one or both of those desired outcomes being taken off the table just because you didn't use the time you had to try and direct yourself towards one of them in reality. Because Huck stalled for too long, just hoping that one day everything would work out, he was forced to make the hard choice when King sold Jim for $40 of drinking money. The point of making a choice is that it's only then when you can direct what resources you have to increasing the odds of the outcome you want. Resources like money, your network, your free time, those could be used to improve your odds of reaching one destination that you want. But when you sit on the raft, avoiding the choice, the raft is still moving downriver towards some outcome. And when you don't put in your effort into directing where it goes, odds are it won't go somewhere you want to be. Here's a quick modern day example. If you're in the classic corporate lifestyle with desires to be an entrepreneur situation, the extreme version, which for legal reasons I feel like I should say I'm not advising everyone to do, but the extreme version would be to quit the job, burn the boats, and go all in. But the version we want to avoid is when we say, well, I'll work on the business in my free time and see if I can make it work. But it's not a full commitment. It's not nights and weekends. It's one night per week or one weekend per month where you tinker around with things. Just enough to distract you from investing in a career, but not enough to have a high probability of success on your own. And with this type of behavior, where do you end up in 2 years? You have not progressed in your career because it hasn't been your focus, and you're also no closer to being an entrepreneur. Because you didn't choose which path to invest in fully, time still passed, and you ended up with an undesirable result. That is the unique flavor that Huck Finn gives me to the idea I already discussed in Hamlet, because we've talked on the show about the cost of indecision. But the metaphor of the river adds a real layer to this. Not making a choice isn't keeping you on the sideline in a time stop where you can take your sweet time coming to a choice. You're still moving. To me, the reason, all right then, I'll go to hell is a beautiful line is because it represents the moment Huck realizes he's been stupid to hope he could have it both ways. It's this light switch learning moment where he is forced to finally make the choice he's been avoiding for weeks, if not months. And it's important to note that life didn't get easier for Huck in that moment. In fact, the real work just began. But at least the rest of the book, he had a purpose, he had direction, and he never again debates if he is making the right choice or not, because it's the choice he's committed to. Nothing is guaranteed in life, not even that if you work hard, you'll get what you want. But the odds of getting what you want are massively higher if you make the choice to pursue one path. Because without a clear decision, you are wasting the tools and resources you have to actually achieve anything. Time doesn't care what you do. It's going to pass one way or the other. But only you can free yourself from choice paralysis and actually do something with your precious time on this planet. The cure for paralysis isn't certainty that you're right, but it's understanding what the cost of your choice might be and deciding that it's one you're willing to pay. And that does it for Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. What did you think of this story? There are a lot of film versions for this. Most of them are pretty old, like old enough that they feel outdated to modern audiences in many ways. Personally, I liked the 1993 version where Huck is played by a young Elijah Wood. I won't say too much about it, except one thing that made me chuckle. If anyone is keeping track of how many movies have a scene at the end where Elijah Wood's character wakes up in a bed after a life-threatening event where he smiles as his friends come through the door one by one, well, it's not just Return of the King. This Huck Finn movie makes the total count at least 2. Thank you for being a listener. Stick around. We've got loads more books to share and characters to analyze. Protagonists, we're not done yet. I've already mentioned a few of the items for today, but I've got a list to go through. Plus that bonus episode of Twain's first short story, which will likely be out next week. But to the rest of you, thank you for tuning in. This is Jameson signing off from another episode of BTMC. We'll see you back here real soon.